Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Burning Questions. And the topic that set the internet on fire this week is how can Russia continue to sell gas and oil and make all of this money to support its invasion of Ukraine while having all of these sanctions imposed on it? And in this conversation, we're going to attempt and answer this question.
Hello, I'm Jason Kirkpatrick, and I'm the head of communications at Razom We Stand, a Ukrainian-based organization that's working hard to dry up funding going towards Russia and its brutal war in Ukraine.
Amazing. Can you share a little bit with us of how does Russia make the most of its money and what were the figures like pre full-scale invasion?
Right. Well, it's been said that Russia is a gas station that's also a country, so that's kind of funny. But Russia does make most of its money from its fossil fuel exports. The figures about exactly how much they had before the invasion, I'm not sure. But what I do know is in the first half of 2024, their revenues from oil and gas sales increased by 41% year on year, which is absolutely unacceptable. And they reached 65 billion in the last year. And this is exactly the opposite of what we want. We would like to see an absolute curtailment of anyone. Nobody should be buying Russian fossil fuels, oil, LNG gas, and supporting this war. We've been calling for that, and we're continuing to call for that, and we'll be talking about that more in this program, I believe.
Yeah. For some, I'm imagining that someone who doesn't know a lot about this, who's watching this program, is thinking, well, but if we curtail all of the sales of Russian oil, how can we substitute it? So for you to say, well, I agree with you, but for you to say no one should be buying gas and oil from Russia, what's a feasible way to substitute for it from other places, and how long would it take?
Okay, the unfortunate fact is that the war is coming on 3 years now,
Yeah.
and the transition to get off of these Russian fossil fuels is not fast enough. We've been demanding from the beginning that nobody should be buying buying these fossil fuels, and we see that this transition away is just way too slow. So we are pushing the envelope, we are pushing hard, and we are calling for a full embargo. We do this in every country that we can. So whether it's the UK, the US, Germany, we encourage all of these countries to find alternatives. Let's look at Germany, for example. Germany has a rapid build out of clean energy. Luckily, they've been thinking ahead. And we have to admit that Trump was also pushing them 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. Trump even pushed Angela Merkel and said, you shouldn't rely on Russian gas. You shouldn't rely on Nord Stream. You should be independent. And in this fact, he was actually right. What countries should have started doing, and they should start doing immediately now if they haven't already, if they want to be serious about their own energy security, if they want to be sure about their own economic future and have affordable energy, they need to start promoting clean energy. So Germany is a country where we've seen in the last winter, or in the last year, there have been times where clean energy has totally exceeded fossil fuels. It's more affordable. We see success in China. So China has
Yeah.
also taken issues seriously. They've started investing in solar panels,
Hmm.
electric cars, and this is bringing down the need. So we have to look seriously, as you say, what can we do today? This is very hard, and at the same time, we need to start planning for the future. So some success stories that we're seeing in Ukraine, where energy security is at the top of the list, is
Hmm.
some hospitals, for example, some schools have started to put solar panels on the roof. They've started this before the full-scale
Hmm.
invasion, even a number of years ago beforehand. And the people that were thinking far ahead, they're the ones that still have functioning electrical systems in hospitals, schools, and we need to just see this faster. This has to happen faster.
So when you talk to, well, I guess when you lobby governments to stop buying Russian oil, what do you notice are the most major arguments against and major drawbacks? Like why? What is their reasoning to continue buying Russian oil?
It's always economics. It always has been economics. It always will be economics. Um, and it's this. Let me explain it simply because a lot of
Hmm.
people don't understand I can understand, especially for Ukrainians that are immensely, extremely frustrated with the West or Western Europe for not doing this sooner. I can understand. I would be bitter, angry, and frustrated if I was in Ukraine. And the reason politicians are doing this is because politicians, when they call for anything that means higher gas prices, that means a voter, when they go to the pump and they fill up their car every week, that's where they see the prices immediately. They see the prices going up immediately. Wow, all of a sudden I'm filling up my car, and instead of in the USA, it used to be $50, then a couple of years ago it was $100. And they're bitter and they're angry because Ukraine is really far away from the US, and they vote those leaders out. So this is not a new problem. It's a problem in my lifetime since the early mid 70s, where there was the OPEC oil crisis, energy shortages. And I remember as a young kid in the USA waiting in line to fill up the car with my parents at a gas station. The prices were skyrocketing, and they voted the leaders out. So politicians, for their own self-interest, they want to keep prices low, and this is why they've been continuing to allow Russian fossil fuels to be exported, continuing to buy them. They've set this price per barrel too high. They've been talking about 70 and then 60 or $65 a barrel. This is just too high, and we need to do a lot more. So this is the one argument that the politicians keep talking about. We have to keep the energy prices low. And it's not only for the voters who are going to punish them at the ballot box. It's also industry. Who has the strongest lobby? It's not just average voters, but the people who speak directly to politicians. These are the leaders of industry. And so if you talk about industry in the US, industry in the UK, for example, or France or Germany, they will tell every politician, they say it publicly, if we don't have the cheapest energy sources, then we can't compete with other industry anywhere else, whether it's Eastern Europe or Russia or China or India. Whoever is going to subsidize or get the cheapest energy, that's the country that's going to have the most competitive pricing on all the industrial products they make, whether it's cars or whatever. And the whole entire health of the economy centers around this. So every country, every politician wants the cheapest energy possible. This is also one of the reasons Angela Merkel chose to work with Putin and, as she said, get the cheaper gas from Nord Stream.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so since you've talked about America and you're from the United States and I've lived in the United States for 14 years, there is quite a bit of change happening in the United States in the past 2 weeks. I feel like they felt like 3 years and it's only been 2 weeks in office. What do you think the new administration is going to be doing about Russia and Russian oil, and how do Trump's statements reflect on oil prices? And I guess where should we see it being taken? Like, kind of, I guess what I'm trying to say is, what should we expect out of this?
Right. Well, the new American president, which we've had before, likes the fact that he's unpredictable. He is unpredictable. He, on occasion, makes he'll say a sentence that contradicts himself, and then the next sentence is on another topic. So we know that he's unpredictable. It's been, in a way, encouraging some of his statements since he's become president. Some of the people he's appointing to have secretary positions, they've been calling for higher sanctions. This is good news for Ukraine. We've heard for years since the first administration how close he is to Putin. The president in America has said this many times. Good news for Ukraine is that he's not as close as we thought he was, that he's actually insulted Putin in the last couple of weeks. He says Putin is like hurting his own country. He's not doing things the right way. Basically insulting Putin, which he hadn't said publicly before. We don't know what Trump says on his personal phone calls that he had with Putin. Trump has reported that he's talked with Putin, I think it was maybe 5 times in the last year or something like that, or the last few years. This, of course, is cause for concern. But to see Trump come out and say that the killing has to stop, the war has to stop, and that there may have to be stronger sanctions, this is a positive message. So we've put out some pieces and press releases saying that we agree with this position. There should be every possibility taken to further improve sanctions, strengthen sanctions. And these sanctions, while they're still not enough, they are having a major impact. So we heard that the last round of sanctions in the last month from the last administration, they put sanctions on different companies, including shipping companies, like insurers, individuals. This meant that in China, Chinese, like ships were sitting outside Chinese ports that weren't able to unload oil from Russia because of American sanctions. So it's not enough. There has to be more. We know that it's been said also, unfortunately, that every dollar sent to Russia is like buying a bullet for Russia to use in Ukraine. This is really horrific. But this is the kind of, I think, messaging that Americans need to understand, Europeans need to understand. And so it's not black and white. We're not going to have complete sanctions now, although I would probably like that. You and your viewers probably like that. It's just not going to happen. But the more we can do, the quicker it's the better for the war and the better for Ukraine, and that's what we push for.
How would you explain, like, to a 5-year-old, why, to an American person who's upset about gas prices, why the embargo on Russia needs to happen?
The unfortunate fact, saying it for a 5-year-old, the unfortunate fact is that there's war on the world, and some countries create wars, and some suffer the brutalities of war, even though they were innocent in the way that they were attacked by other people. And we shouldn't be supporting this brutality because it has real effects to adults, to kids. We've seen the terrible things Russia has done with kids and kidnapping kids and not giving them back. For a 5-year-old, that's a bit too harsh, but we have to make it easy for people to understand that it's every dollar that they spend on these energy sources for Russia has a real impact. And how I try to do that as much as I can also is by telling human stories. I think the point you raise is very important. USA is so far from Ukraine. The west of the USA is so far away from Ukraine that people forget. There's also, unfortunately for Ukraine, there's other wars that are in the news in Israel and Palestine. Almost every day last week, it's something about hostages or whatever, and Ukraine just comes down and down and down the agenda. Very hard to keep the attention of people, especially in America. And we know this. The farther geographically people are away from Ukraine, the harder it is to keep their attention. So I see when I'm talking to people in farther Eastern Europe or Poland, it's in their newspaper every day, right? If you go farther away to the UK or Ireland, we have to push up this storytelling effort a little bit more and share personal stories of people who have suffered and are suffering every day in Ukraine. That's the same or even much more in the US. We have to keep these basic human stories alive so that people can make a connection and understand the impact that their money has.
This is actually, I agree with you, and I have a question that just came to my mind, and it might not be on topic at all, but I'm wondering. So there are protests, especially in the UK. They're done mostly in the UK by the organization that's called Just Stop Oil, and they do a lot of protests with spilling paint on paintings and stuff to sort of like show their position of like renewable energy and things like that. What do you think about these types of efforts, and do you think they hurt the actual general effort of stopping oil?
Right. On the idea of tactics of civil disobedience, I think there are better ways to get attention. I understand the arguments of some of these folks that if they're not using some of these tactics, then they're not relevant, and everybody wants to be relevant. However, there's a lot of even analysis done of public opinion of these kind of climate protests, and even people who are generally sympathetic to climate protests are often not sympathetic to these kind of protests. So it's interesting if someone puts paint on a famous painting, splashes paint on a famous painting somewhere, even if there's glass in front of the painting and it doesn't actually damage the painting, the newspaper headline generally says, activist throws paint at painting. And so most people just read the headlines. 90% of people who read are scrolling on their mobile phone and just see the headline. So these activists are not using what I would personally consider the best tactics. But the fact at the same time is direct action does turn into change. Having thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets and being active brings change. I'm living in Germany, and we know that hundreds of thousands of people on the street is what brought down the Berlin Wall. So
Yeah.
uh, we we can see that protest is needed. People do need to be on the streets, and then I would encourage some to really look at the best use of their tactics.
Makes sense. And then I guess the next sort of the big part of this conversation is Russia has a shadow fleet, and a lot of people don't understand what the shadow fleet is because while we hear about the sanctions, we think that Russia has less ships, Russia can sell less oil, but then there is a huge part of Russian oil sales that is basically done on the black market, and it's this black market that's a shadow fleet. Would you explain to our viewers what the shadow fleet from Russia is and how detrimental it is to the effort of putting sanctions on Russia and why it would be so important to actually start dealing with that as well?
Sure, that stopping the sanction fleet of Russia is absolutely at the top of the agenda. It needs to happen. It's happening too slowly. I always like to take a historical step back and give a big view, like I shared about the price of the gas pump starting
Yeah.
with the OPEC crisis in the 70s. This issue of shadow fleets, we can also trace back to the end of the 70s when there was regime change in Iran and the USA government put sanctions on Iran. And Iran wanted to find ways to export its oil around sanctions. Iran has lots of experience dealing with sanctions and getting around American sanctions. Their economy has been stopped to a large degree, or not stopped, but some of their income has been curtailed by these sanctions. And of course, we see Iran in the last few years getting closer and closer to Russia. It's also been reported that Iran has been sharing their experience and their successes with sanctions evasion with Russia. Unfortunately for Ukraine, again, Russia has gotten very good at using slippery tricks, changing flags on these ships. They find dirty, old, risky ships, oil tankers, maybe from the 80s or even before, that nobody else will insure. And they're starting to buy them up. And then to explain to people who haven't heard of the Shadow Fleet, it's these ships that they just change the name quickly, or they find some island, some tax evading island or country to change the flag and say this ship is going to be now from Liberia or wherever it's from. And then they change them. And as soon as sanctions are placed on these Shadow Fleet tankers by the US government or the European Union, they often change hands. And there's millions and billions to be made. So unfortunately, there's always somebody out there who's willing to take the risk and buy these ships, and maybe even risk being sanctioned. But we see that it has been effective. These USA sanctions in the last month did result in many, many oil tankers not unloading their fuel in China. So one of the other things we're working on is the next round of European Union sanctions. The 16th sanctions package is being finalized now. They're talking, luckily, about sanctioning a lot more tankers. We're hearing about maybe many, many dozens or maybe up to 100. Would be fantastic if there's a couple of hundred. And when actual tankers are named, then they can be curtailed. Their transport can be curtailed. But there are lots of tricks they use, like turning off their tracking devices. All these major ships have to have tracking devices. They turn them off. They change their names. If one tanker gets sanctioned, they go out to sea into international waters and unload in international waters onto another tanker that's not sanctioned. But there can be more done. So naming these, naming their owners. We've seen that there are companies in the UK, for example, in Scotland, there's a Glasgow company called Seapeak, and they've been involved in some of these tankers or some trading. There's many ways that different countries and different companies in different countries can be involved in helping to facilitate the Russian fossil fuel trade. One, unfortunately, is used by this Seapeak in Glasgow. It can be anything. It could be insuring these ships. It could be buying these ships. It could be helping to buy and sell them. And then another, besides the Shadow Fleet, another problem that we see is from this American company, SLB. They formerly were called Schlumberger. And they're helping Russia to do things like maintain their energy export infrastructure, whether that's pumping oil, refining oil, all of these things, exploring for oil. helping with the machines that are used to facilitate all the transport of oil. There's an American company, SLB, that has been involved in that, even though other American companies like Halliburton, they were pressured in 2022, 2023, and they were forced to back out of Russia, but not this American company, SLB. So we're calling for more sanctions on the shadow fleet. That has to be stopped, but also all of these Western countries that say that they're supporting Ukraine, that are actually supporting Ukraine in many ways, they also at the same time have to stop the hypocrisy and have to stop enabling the Russian fossil fuel industry. This is really horrific and it needs to stop.
Yeah, that makes sense. If we talk about numbers, so for how much trade is Russian shadow fleet responsible in numbers?
I don't have these numbers right in front of me. Let's see. I have some numbers I can find really quickly. For example, in 2024, Russian oil accounted for like 36% of India's imports and 20% of China's imports. A lot of that is done by this shadow fleet. Total figures I don't happen to have here, but we're definitely talking in the billions, and there are hundreds or a couple of hundred of these shadow fleet tankers. If we're talking about LNG tankers, the kind that can export Russian LNG around the Arctic, this is another topic of concern because Putin has wanted to export his LNG gas from the Arctic. There's projects like Arctic 2. And there's less of these huge LNG tankers. They're not so old and they're not so cheap to buy, and they always have to have, or often have to have in winter months, these icebreakers, escorts of icebreakers. So all of these sanctions, especially on the shadow fleet, on these LNG tankers, we need to see them ramped up across the board because it's billions and billions, and I believe it's hundreds of billions of euros or dollars that have been generated for Russia since the war started.
Yeah, that's very, the subject is so fascinating because I feel like you mentioned in the beginning of this conversation that Russia is the world's gas station that also happens to be a country, right? And their main income comes from being a gas station and from selling oil. And of course, once you start placing sanctions and embargoes and stuff like that, Russia is not going to give up, and Russia is not going to just accept it. They're going to look for sneaky, sleazy ways of still selling their gas because, well, I mean, if anyone has ever looked at Russia or Russian history or Russian relations with anything, they're not honest people and they don't accept, they are not an honest country and they don't accept, they do a lot of shady dealing. So it's really crazy to see how, the world, even though we're not doing enough, but how we've come together to sort of do as much as we think we can. And it almost doesn't impact Russia, right? Up until like recently, Russia was transporting gas to Hungary and Slovakia through Ukraine, which is quite a crazy thing because, yes, Ukraine makes like a tiny bit of profit out of it, right? Because we're landing them our land basically to transport the gas. But at the same time, like they're making money off of transporting the gas through the country they're currently trying to destroy. And I think no one really thought about that. And part of the reason why that was happening was Angela Merkel, and a lot of the dealings back in her time. So there is this kind of idea that Angela Merkel is one of the largest reasons why Russia has become such a popular gas station for the world and why they're able to make so much money. What do you think of that, especially as someone who lives in Germany? Because there has been a lot of flack given to Angela Merkel in the past. I guess for like in layman's terms, for like a regular person that doesn't follow European politics too closely, we used to hear about Angela Merkel as like this iron lady who was like Germany's, a Bundeskanzler, and she was like this very, very ominous, very respected figure. And then in the past 2-3 years, we keep hearing about her, and it goes just. The popularity contest was kind of from here to absolutely here. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, that's what you described is exactly the perspective of her in Germany. That as she left office a few years ago, she was quite liked by most. I mean, she's a conservative from the CDU party, so a lot of people who are in the other parties didn't like her politics. But she was seen as like a stable influence. And you're right, her star has gone down, and in fact, she She has a new autobiography out in the last couple of months, and she doesn't really apologize for dealing with Putin the way she did and this Nord Stream. And she says it was the right thing to do. I think most people disagree. This is why her popularity has gone down on the average since she left office. As someone who's concerned about economics and energy and climate, during the time that she was the chancellor, I was one of these people also going to different kind of protests saying, no, we should be putting this public subsidy not into Nord Stream, but into clean energy, which it turns out in hindsight that I was right on this one and Merkel was wrong. But I think this stable influence that she had, that was a positive thing that she in Germany she was seen as a stable person as opposed to a crazy kind of politician. But I want to come back to another point that you said. You talked about how we can't trust Putin and Russia and honesty. So we can't control Putin from where we are and his decisions. It's been said also that in war the first casualty is truth. What we can deal with is our countries, so where I'm from in Europe, Western Europe, or in the USA, that we or companies in these countries shouldn't be collaborating with Russia. This is what we or the West has more control about over, and I mean specifically leaders. So Olaf Scholz in Germany, or now it's Keir Starmer in the UK, or it was Biden and now Trump in the US. What we can influence, at least, I mean, they have the power, but we can influence those people, whereas it's not so easy to influence Putin. What we can tell these leaders and have to keep telling them is, you need to stop collaborating with Russia in any way. You need to stop allowing their oil to be exported, even at this price cap. You need to put stronger sanctions on this shadow fleet. You need to stop your companies like SLB in Texas in the USA, helping Russian fossil fuel companies. In the UK, we can say CPEAK in Glasgow in Scotland, which is kind of controlled by the UK government in this area. They need to stop collaborating with Russia. That's where we do have influence, and we need to keep the pressure on these areas. Of course, Ukraine and Ukrainians are doing everything they can on the front lines. I always give praise to them for the very strong fight that they keep up. That's of course very hard, and they deserve praise, and they have my praise. But in the West, we need to keep pressure on our leaders to stop collaborating with Russia in any way, to stop collaborating with Putin. And I also want to point out that it's not just that every euro and every dollar is buying effectively a bullet for the Russian military, but these countries, Germany and the UK, they're funding Russian sabotage and influence in their own country. In Germany, we've seen repeated sabotage of military bases. We saw an attempt a few months ago in Germany for sabotage of the water supply. We've seen assassinations done in the UK and in Germany in recent years. Skripal in the UK. There are others. In Germany, in Berlin, there was a murder in Tiergarten, in the Tiergarten Park a few years ago. And so it's not just that these European countries and leaders are sending money to Russia to do horrendous things in Ukraine and commit war crimes and terrible atrocities. They're even funding attacks on their own countries. Germany, the European Union have said publicly that Putin and Russia and the Kremlin are attacking the democratic system and that they're interfering in elections. They've interfered in this Slovakian election, other elections, and they're funding sabotage of their own democracies. This is ridiculous, and this has to stop as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that honestly, Europe is kind of waking up to it, right? A little bit. The US is, well, it's very far in proximity. So obviously, when war starts coming closer to you, you start caring more. So I think that's what's happening with Europe, especially with all the acts of sabotage and cables being cut and all of these things. It's looming. So at least the European people are slowly starting to understand the reality and what Russia is ready to do, because you can't really say that the war is just on Ukrainian territory when there are all of these acts of sabotage and there are all of these attacks and all of these. I mean, politicians being installed and paid for in various different countries, right? Like in Germany recently, of course, Putin loves the far right German party, but also now somehow Elon Musk is very much fond of them. And there are all of these things happening. So you can't really say anymore, right, that this is just about Ukraine or this just is happening in Ukraine, because of, obviously it's happening in Europe. It's also been happening in the United States for the longest time, but I guess no one's really woken up to it yet. What do you think we as regular citizens, both in Europe, I guess in the collective West, can do and should do on a daily basis to hammer in the idea to those around us and to our lawmakers that, you know, the more aggressive we are on Russia, the more security we ourselves will have?
Well, you're doing your bit. You're speaking out, and I encourage. I mean, unfortunately, the weight of the world falls upon Ukrainians in this, and it's an incredible load to bear. It's impossible. I can understand, but especially I would encourage people who are Ukrainians living in the U.S. or living outside, continue to talk to people who are not Ukrainians. Continue to share your stories. People like me, I continue to put out press releases. I continue to write and. At our organization, Razom We Stand, we try very hard in the European Union and across Europe, in the USA, to make influence, and just don't give up. Continuously action. I mean, also people have to take care of themselves. People understandably need a break. I'm sorry that Ukrainians haven't had a break for 3 years.
Yeah.
This is really hard, and I praise you also for doing what you do. But continue making that effort. If it's going on the streets to a protest, whatever you do. I also have a little Ukrainian flag I carry around in my backpack every day. I try to at least keep things visible, and staying visible, staying active, not giving up. That's the way we win.
Yeah, I appreciate that you just mentioned that you carry a Ukrainian flag on your backpack, because as a Ukrainian, whenever I go back to the U.S. to visit the U.S. or whenever I go anywhere in Europe really, and I see Ukrainian flags places, or someone having like, you know, or someone wears clothing that is blue and yellow, or basically there is like symbolism of Ukraine somewhere, I think that doesn't let people forget, because they're in the back of their mind, they're like, oh wait, why is this person wearing a Ukrainian symbolism? Like, what does it mean? Did something happen? So they go and look it up. Well, the news isn't showing it, and you as a Ukrainian, when you see it, you kind of feel, you know, you feel warmth because every day you sort of, when you don't see Ukraine on the news, and when bombings and Russia and Russian fleet and just Russia is becoming normalized, and no one really reacts to it the same way as they did in the first days of the invasion, you kind of get down. But then, you know, things like that pick you up, because it's you know that people take time of their everyday life to care. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for sharing it, and thank you for this conversation today. I think it's going to be very, very enlightening and insightful for a lot of people who don't understand why Russia's oil is so important to block, and how we got here, how we got to the world that's dependent on Russia as a gas station. So thank you very much. I hope to see you here again at some point, and thank you for sharing your insight.
Sure, I'd be happy to be on again. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, hopefully this conversation was as insightful to you as it was to me. I always love learning new facts, and I always love learning inner workings of difficult topics like this one. So if you enjoyed this conversation, and if you would like to hear more conversations like this one, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, and also turn on all of your notifications so you don't miss when the next episode comes out. And of course, send this video to a friend, give it a like, and comment your questions, suggestions, constructive criticism, I don't know, a greeting, because I read all of it and I really appreciate hearing from you guys. And yeah, I try to implement your suggestions or your ideas in the next episodes, or gather topics from your suggestions. Thanks, and see you next time.